Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show which discusses any and all topics under the sun from a woman's point of view. Here's today's moderator, Ty Goodwin.
Hello and welcome to It's a Woman's World. My name is Ty Goodwin and I'm happy to be with you today because we're going to be talking about my favorite things, books, and a couple of literacy-based projects. Before we get into our conversation with today's guest, I'd like to introduce today's co-hosts, Susan Strauss.
Hi, Ty.
And Katie DeZeller.
Hello.
Glad to have both of you here today.
Thanks.
Now for our guest, Nadia Giordana of Wink and Lynn Garthwaite of Books on Wings. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Let's jump into the conversation.
So you have a magazine called Wink. What is that?
Well, you know, I had some literary magazines a few years ago, way back 10, 15, and even 20 years ago. And one was Poetry in Motion and one was Mississippi Crow Magazine, which life gets in the way and you get busy, and I had retired those magazines, and last year I decided I wanted to do it again so badly. But I didn't feel like resurrecting any of the new or any of the old names. I needed to come up with a new name. So what we have is Wink. And it's kind of an acronym. It's not an exact acronym. Is acronym the right word? Mm-hmm. W-I-N-K. But as you can see, W is purple, I-N-K, ink for ink. But writers in the know, you can see writers in, the is assumed, and no. So sometimes I have to explain that because people say, well, it's not exactly the same. It works, and it works for the readers, and it works for us.
Oh, that's creative.
Yes, and it's a literary magazine. We publish poetry, short stories, articles, artwork, and photography.
Mm. Wow. So how do you find people who will contribute to it?
People come from all around the world. What was surprising is I had an old database from my previous projects years ago, and I did send out one email, and that was to 800-900 people that still seem semi-active with emails, and I got several hundred positive responses back. And then the rest of the people are local Minneapolis and Twin Cities. And the magazine is also listed in Writers Market, which is a big source for people coming from all over the world.
Yeah.
Poets and Writers, and Duotrope. So people come from many different places.
Where do you get it? I mean, you've given me a couple copies, but where would I find it?
People can get the magazine from me. People can get it from Ann Obbitz, who is our publisher, our printer, and online, it's listed online. The website, winkwriters.com, has all of the information that anybody might want, but it's a print magazine with a digital companion.
Okay, okay. Who is the targeted audience?
That's young and old alike. I would say maybe not that young. We certainly are have tackled and printed, especially in this issue, some controversial and sensitive subjects, adult subjects. So even though the material runs from lighthearted to funny, we also take some subjects that would be more of an adult audience.
Are there any pieces of content that have really gotten like a lot of responses, or a lot of people just really excited about the piece?
I hear that from some of the poetry at times, and even a short story now and then, but not any one that stands out to me right now. Yeah.
If people are interested in submitting their pieces, whether it's the photography or an article, how do they go about doing that?
I have complete guidelines online, but as an overview, short poetry from 32 lines or less, short stories, 1,200 words or less, flash fiction, which is real short, also good. The shorter the better, because it's not a big, thick magazine, we want to showcase as many people as possible. But the guidelines will talk about the kind of things we're looking for. We do like quirky, unusual. End the story. Don't just let it trail off like it was a study in English class. It's all written perfectly, but there's no ending, no point to it. I love to see a twist in it, even if it's a little bit odd.
And so who determines what will actually get published in the magazine? I mean, do you have a ton of people that will submit proposals, so to speak, every month, or how do you determine that?
Submissions come in all the time, but interestingly enough, I might be the final filter, but with short stories, Lynn is our short story fiction editor. And when the submissions come to me, I immediately, once in a while, if the title is catchy enough, I'll take a peek at it. But I really like to immediately shoot it off to Lynn, because I really rely on Lynn's opinion of the story. She sends me a synopsis. I don't know, other than maybe one story that we ever only half disagreed about. And so it's a good fit, because she thinks like I do. So they go to her, she sends them to me. If there's a thumbs up, they get the second chance. If there's thumbs down, I don't even give it the second read.
And it is nice, we do have pretty similar tastes in what we're looking for. She talked about stories with a twist. We can go a little dark, but we also like the funny and humorous, quirky, that kind of thing. So I read them first with that eye. Sometimes I'll read something, I like the story, but I know, wow, it's going to take a lot of editing because there are a lot of mistakes in it, so that's something to note. So when I send her a synopsis, I'll give her a brief synopsis of what it's about, I'll give my opinion, and then the thumbs up or thumbs down. I keep track of everything that I've
and thumbs sideways.
Yeah, there have been a couple of yellow lights, I guess I call them, because I'm not sure. I'd like now her to take a second look at it. And in fact, one of the stories that I gave that thumb sideways to early on ended up much later being one of my favorite stories. So it's kind of worth a second look at. At first glance, it was kind of dark, kind of almost creepy, but it had such a compelling story and characters. And it was a flash fiction. It was very short, and such an interesting twist ending that it actually ended up being one of my favorites. So kind of we worked together on that.
What do you mean exactly by a flash fiction? I'm not familiar with that
It is
term.
kind of a new term, I think. And it might vary from publisher to publisher, but in our sense, in our context, if you were to picture a story typed on a page, single-spaced, it might just be half a page.
Wow.
So we're talking very short, maybe a full page, but that would be about it. So flash meaning, you can read it in just a couple of minutes. In fact, I read it out loud recently, and it took me just over a minute and a half to read it. So that gives you an idea of the very short, which is very difficult to write.
It's hard to do.
Would be very difficult to write, especially if you need a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Exactly, and you do, and you want to compel your readers to want to keep reading. So it's a hard genre to write, but it's fun to read.
Could you give some examples of what topics have been covered in your poetry and in your flash fiction?
Oh, that's across the board. I'd say I'm hesitating because I'd say not so much love, because love can get real sappy, to put it mildly. So there's some love poetry, but most of the poetry is a little more interesting, a little more cryptic, a little more about life, a little bit less about love, and definitely free verse and unrhymed poetry is much more open for what we want for the magazine than form poetry and sing-songy rhymed poetry.
Thought-provoking type things, the thing that make you say, wow, I hadn't thought of that way, or,
Exactly.
or how interesting was that, how well was that put,
Make
those
us
kind of
think.
things. Yeah.
I'm curious about the publishing process. So how long does it take to actually put together one of the issues of the magazine?
Well, I must be insane because the hours, I put a couple hundred hours into this magazine before it ever even sees the first print.
Wow.
And then I get Lynn involved, and I get the editors, the copy editors involved. But a lot of hours goes into it. The the thing is, I do enjoy formatting and the artistic part of shaping the pages and matching poetry to artwork. All that creative process, it's an outlet for me. So for me, I'm the artist. This is my work, but the materials is someone else's art. And it just gives it double pleasure.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept because so many of us, like, we like to write and we like to draw and we like to do all different kinds of things. And you've taken a few different passions and put them together that brings pleasure and enjoyment to other people.
And it showcases people with talent who wouldn't have a voice in any other way, or very few. 20 years ago, there were a lot of independent literary magazines where people had this option, but now, aside from a few colleges and some other places, which still isn't the same, something completely independent like this and open to almost anything, and being able to have a print copy doesn't exist.
It's so interesting. You'd think it'd be the opposite now with all of the self-publishing opportunities that there are. You'd think you'd see more of it.
It's more e-zines because that's more cost effective. It's very expensive any other way.
But it's a nice outlet for writers and aspiring writers, because we don't look at a material and ask them their resume. We're not asking, have you been published before? You know, we're only going to look at things through agents. There's nothing like that. We're looking at pure material. Do we like it or we do not like it? You know, and so it's a good opportunity for aspiring writers who maybe have sent their materials off elsewhere and been sent, you know, the thank yous but no thanks letters. They may have a good chance getting into ours.
Does age matter?
Not at all.
So your teenage children can submit like anybody else, yes?
That's good. That's great.
And we've had some contributors that are a lot older,
right?
You know,
Oh, what does that mean?
a lot older. We've had a couple 80, 90-year-olds that probably.
Just wondering what the older thing was referring to.
Not my age. That's middle-aged.
And literally from around the world, because she had that database from before of contributors from before. So in different issues, we've had from people from India, from England, from Australia,
Wow.
Indonesia. So
Yeah, and there's one person which surprised me, came in recently, and he is from, I'm trying to think of the name of the island now, but it's an island nation 1,200 miles off the coast of Africa that I had never heard of, and a submission came in from a man living out there somewhere. So, you know, thank goodness for the internet.
Yeah.
Talk about global reach.
Yes, absolutely.
it's fun.
And I should tell you, one of the things that brought Lynn into being the short story editor in the magazine is her projects with Books on Wings and getting books into the hands of underserved children. And that's part of the reason that Lynn became part of this project.
We have a shared interest in literacy across the board, and yeah, it seems like all of our projects seem to overlap each other in one way or the other, and being part of a large women's writers group is quite the asset too.
Yeah, well, I love books. I've loved books ever since I was second, third grade and tried to force people to play library at my house.
Oh, nice.
To play library.
I would have played.
Yes, yes. So can you tell us a little bit about Books on Wings and the work that you do with the organization?
Sure, thank you. It's 2013 is when I came up with this concept of this nonprofit. The idea being to get books into the hands of these kids in underserved communities. A lot of them don't own their own books. A lot of them don't have access to libraries, even though they're free. Maybe there's not transportation in the family, in the household, or parents are working 3 jobs and there's not the time. So came up with this concept, put together a board. You were very much a part of it, Ty, so I'm grateful for that. The idea being, let's get books that are curriculum related into the hands of kids who don't have the same resources that their more affluent peers have. And each book that we bring into their classroom, the child takes home at the end of the lesson as a permanent gift. So it begins a library in their home, hopefully spreads the reading interest to the family, and they can talk about that particular topic with the family. And
So since it's a nonprofit, is it a lot of work?
it can be a lot of work. You know, we spread it out between many hands. We have a board of directors, but sure, it's a lot of time. Luckily, it's a work of passion, so we enjoy it. It's fun to do, and it also is a little bit seasonal because we're working with school districts. Most of our work is done during the school year, so summers are pretty quiet for us, although we're kind of preparing for the next year. But we spend a lot of time contacting the schools and asking them for their wish lists of books and things like that. So, and then we are working with local booksellers. We have some good business relationships with booksellers and where we purchase the books. So it can be a lot of time, but it's something we really enjoy.
As a former teacher, I'm tuned into the word curriculum-led. So can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by curriculum-led?
So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're not educators. We want to provide books that the teachers have told us would be helpful in their classroom. So they know what the curriculum is that they're doing, and they can tell us, excuse me, in 2 months we're going to be talking about animal habitats. And so therefore this would be a good title, and they provide us with some titles of books that would augment that curriculum. So we're not trying to tell them what to teach. They know what they're teaching. We're just providing books that they have told us would be helpful for the students in that guide.
Okay, and I'm trying to understand, is this for students that come from homes that they may not have as much access to books, or is it also for school districts that might be struggling with, I guess they all are these days, with their budgetary constraints?
Well, kind of both, but mostly we're going to schools that specifically serve those communities. So there are some charter schools, some public schools, and we can use the Minnesota State education standards to let us know which schools are struggling with their focus ratings, some of the terms. The ones that are having trouble with that achievement gap. So that information is available to us, and so we can go specifically to schools that are dealing with some of these issues. So you wouldn't likely find us in an affluent neighborhood because they're doing quite well in those regards. But so we are dealing specifically with schools, but schools that are specifically on the radar of the state that are struggling in those areas.
How many books would you say in a school year do you contribute to these schools?
I would say, just to give out a number, roughly about 2,000. So
wow.
we serve every kindergarten, first grader, second and third grader, and that's intentional because studies have shown that if students are not at reading level by grade 3, they tend to really drop off quickly. So we're looking to catch them before third grade. So those are the grade levels we're serving at this time. When we get bigger, we'd love to serve the higher grades too. But and so it depends on the enrollment in each school. But typically, you might have about 100 in each grade level, and we are giving them more than one book per year. So just to use a round number, about 2,000 books for each school per year.
This is a great program, and I remember when you first mentioned it, and I was super excited. I'm a former teacher as well, and so just knowing that kids were going to get to have books in the classroom, but take them home as well.
Right.
What inspired you to start this?
Kind of just hearing that on our news how poorly Minnesota does with our achievement gap. Now, Minnesota has always done very well in education. We've always ranked quite high, but specifically in the achievement gap, we're horrible. We're in like the bottom half. And so it was just one of those things I thought, we have to do something about this. And my being a book lover, my thought was we got to get more books. And so it evolved over time, talking to people like Ty, an educator, others who came up with this concept of let's do it through the schools. So it's more of a organized way. It's not just random books being handed to kids in parks and things like that. So it evolved that way. And what we found is when we'd go to the schools, and we'd spread these books out on the table and bring kids into the the lunchroom where we'd have this assembly and see their eyes light up. And I can remember the very first time some kids looking at the books and saying, "Are those for us?" Like they didn't dare believe that these books were for them. And yes, they are. And like, we get to keep them? Like the looks on their faces was all it took. I mean, that is so gratifying. And to know, and when they clutch them to themselves as they walk away, so gratifying. So every bit of the work has been well worth it.
Have you gotten that on recording that, the kids' faces?
Yes, we've had some photographers come in and do that. We've done a little bit of video, and and then we've gotten feedback from the teachers as well, kind of testimonials, notes from the students. We'll get a whole packet of notes, the next month or something with all their little thank you notes.
That's
Best
great.
job in the world.
Yeah. So how can people get involved? Like, do you allow people to help or anything?
At different times we're looking for volunteers. We're such a small organization that we haven't expanded quite to that large mass volunteer thing. But if they want to check out our website, we'd love it. It's booksonwings.org. And that'll give some more ideas of what we do, who we are, who our board members are, and when we do have volunteer opportunities, that's where we post them.
That's great.
And Lynn, you have a couple of other book projects. Is it creative book project? There's some children's books and the one about the states. I love that one.
Well, and I started in my writing career, I started writing children's books, and so that was my early passion. And I'm right now hired to do another picture book for a local publisher, so I'm working on that. I've got a deadline coming up pretty soon. But the book I most recently published for myself was called Our States Have Crazy Shapes. That's the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
To explain in layman's terms why we have this weird jigsaw puzzle of a map and the quirky stories behind the stories. That's my passion too. I was a history major in college, so researching and writing things like that, that's my heart as well. Luckily, or maybe horribly, I have 12 or 15 different interests, and so right now I have 3 different projects I'm working on at the same time.
I think it's lucky for us. And I remember when I first heard about the book, about the states, I was fascinated because I never thought of that before. So what's the quirkiest story?
To me, my favorite is the Missouri Boot Heel, and just the very short synopsis is a man who owned a large cattle ranch in the northeast corner of Arkansas Territory. So when Missouri and Arkansas were both still territories, he realized that his ranch would be worth a lot more money if it was part of Missouri, which was just about to become a state. And Missouri had the St. Louis, the gateway town. All the commerce was going through there. He knew his property would be worth a lot more if it was part of Missouri. So he lobbied Congress to include his property in Missouri when it became ratified as a state. And sure enough, next year when they drew the final boundaries, they drew it around his property, which is what we now know as the Missouri Boot Heel. But that's an example of the kind of quirky, odd, like, are you kidding me kind of moments that I discovered researching for this book.
I think another thing you and I were talking about before the show was how there are some states that are still in conflict about what their border is.
True, yes.
To this day.
200 years later. And most of it is because of rivers. That's a problem. Rivers formed a lot of borders in the early days, especially on the East Coast. But there's a problem because rivers have a way of changing their course over time. And then the question is, where exactly is this border? Because the river is no longer where it was 200 years ago. So there are a few examples that are currently being fought in the courts between neighboring states because they're fighting over exactly where that, now that we have GPS, if they can ever set it, it'll be permanently set. But it couldn't in those days. And there were surveying errors in those days too that created some problems that are still problems to this day.
And didn't you say something, I think it was with Oklahoma and Texas, where the river is part Oklahoma, part Texas, but right smack in the middle, it's federal?
Right, so the
Neither
part of
state?
the river forms the border, part of the border between Oklahoma and Texas. They share that border. But because the river has changed course, that's caused some problems. And the way they defined it early on is that the northern half of the river would be part of Oklahoma territory. The southern half would be Texas territory, but the strip right down the middle was to remain federal territory.
Wow.
And now that river has changed course and it's all kinds of complications. So that one also is being fought in the courts right now.
So interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
Very fun.
A lot of head slapping moments, a lot of like, I call them did you know moments. Now when I speak about it, it's all did you know? Did you know we used to have a state called Franklin?
Oh, we did?
I did not know that either until I started. We did.
Where
was
is
that?
it? Where was it?
It was in what is now the northeast corner of Tennessee. So it ended up being absorbed into Tennessee after 4 years. Kind of just they couldn't make it financially is the bottom line, and they got absorbed into Tennessee. But we had a legitimate state called Franklin, and if you go to that part of the country right now, if you go to that part of Tennessee, you'll find that people are very proud of that history, and they'll have businesses called like the State of Franklin Savings and Loan, or the State of Franklin Deli and Bakery. I mean, there's something they have a lot of pride in.
That would be a great class to take. Like if someone was teaching about all the history of the states that way.
Well, and the History Channel did do the same book that inspired my book, and I wanted to write in layman's terms what that textbook was. That same book inspired a History Channel show called How Our States got their shapes. And so that's something people can tune into. A lot of it is crossover with my material. So,
Fantastic, fantastic. So are there any other projects that you ladies are working on?
That's odd.
Oh, yes, that's right. I almost forgot. Lynn and I do a television program at LMCC, Lake Minnetonka Communications Commission, and it's called That's Odd, which the name came up, and the idea for the show was Lynn's.
Because I'm a little odd.
I had a completely different program in mind when I asked Lynn to meet with me, and I said, I have a project. It might be fun to do a project. And as we were talking, she came up with, because she thought I might be wanting to do something different. And I said, let me hear your idea. And okay, put the other idea aside. Let's talk about this. And it's a fun TV program, and we try to visit unique places that are not always the first place that you might think you would go. Not the A-list of visiting places like the Spam Museum and things like that. And we always have interesting things happen, mishaps. We do a lot of Did You Know?
Right. Yeah,
when we
fill
do
in,
our dialogue.
If we have a topic, like our last show, the topic was magic, and so then we did a whole segment on Did You Know, and then some interesting fun facts about magic and the history of magic. So every episode has a different theme, and we do some Did You Knows on that, and we visit a lot of places, take a lot of footage. We do some kind of crazy things. We have a tendency to tip over things accidentally.
It's very freeing.
Yes, yes. We're a little odd, so lots of programs.
More about what you said with magic. I love magic.
Yes, we had a magician as our guest, and he right in front of us did these acts, and we're sitting literally right next to him, and we could not figure out how he did it.
That's amazing.
The sleight of hand was fantastic, so we'll have to tune into that show.
Well, America's Got Talent has some wonderful musicians, and the camera will be right there, and it's the same thing.
I know.
How did they do it?
I know, and half of you wants to know how, and the other half you don't want to know.
Yeah, 'cause
Like,
you never
I don't
want
want to know because I love the mystery. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that we are now in the know about writers in the know. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing about Books on Wings and our states have some crazy shapes.
Our states have crazy shapes.
Our
Yes.
states have crazy shapes.
Yes.
That's good information to know, and it really is exciting and fun, and it's also interesting to know all the ways that you guys are using all of your different passions in what you do. So thank you for sharing that.
Fun.
Well, that's it for today's episode. Thank you for joining us, and come back again when I'm sure we'll have another entertaining episode for you to take part in. Thank you.